Eric's voice is the voice I can always hear over everybody's voice. Yes. All right, we're going to get started with our next session. And this one's going to be fun because we get to sing a song. Unloose the goose. Anyway, this is a fellow goose from the Unloose the Goose days. We've got 3 geese in the room right now. Well, actually, one of them's not in the room. 3 geese on property, anyway. And the thing that CJ doesn't know is I knew who he was before he became a goose, because when I started podcasting, my bee mentor said, "Hey, I'm listening to this thing called the Dangerous History Podcast. It's really good. I recommend you check it out." And so I have spent many an hour behind the wheel listening to CJ talk about parts of history I never understood. He was a professor of history for 16 years and recently made the leap into a freer lifestyle of podcaster and dangerous purveyor of history. But what you don't know about him is he was bitten by snake mania. He has, what is it, 8?
10
snakes from 6 or 8 species. So,
which legally I think qualifies me as an animal hoarder.
He is an animal hoarder. Well, you hoard rabbits too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean,
that's what everybody says.
He's going to talk to us about the Dark Age right now. And I have so I'll help you with the slides when you want to show them.
Okay.
So come on
up. All right. It is nice to finally be here. After running the gauntlet, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, after running the gauntlet yesterday of missing my first flight and having to get on a later one and all that stuff. So, yeah, hopefully what I say will actually make sense. Fingers crossed and all that. So, if you listen to my podcast much, you know that I love a good quote. I like to drop a good quote in whenever I can. So, of course, I've got to have some for this. So, first one is one that probably most or all of you will recognize. You may not immediately recognize it coming from my voice, though. But let's see. The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was lost, much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it. Lord of the Rings. Very first words of the first Lord of the Rings movie, right? Spoken by Galadriel, played by Kate Blanchett. And that's a quote I couldn't help but thinking of when I was thinking of what I was going to say today. And then the other one that I'm going to open up with is a little bit longer, and you're less likely to have heard it unless you caught what I had to say at the Self-Reliance Festival back in the spring. You may remember it from there. But how do I get the projector to light up? Magic. You will put, there we go. Jedi mind trick works on technology too. All right. So this is from a somewhat notorious book, Tragedy and Hope, by Carol Quigley, which is a giant, dry history book that also has interesting real conspiracy stuff kind of drizzled throughout it. And he talks about civilizations going through different phases. And when he talks about what he calls the third phase, he says, when a civilization starts to decline, he says, it is this decline in the rate of expansion of a civilization which marks its passage from the age of expansion to the age of conflict. This latter is the most complex, most interesting, and most critical of all the periods in the life cycle of a civilization. It is marked by 4 chief characteristics. A, it is a period of declining rate of expansion in all senses of the word. Population, economic, territorial, whatever. B, it is a period of growing tensions and class conflicts. C, it is a period of increasingly frequent and increasingly violent imperialist wars. I wonder what phase we're in right now. By the way, he wrote this in the mid-20th century. It wasn't like he wrote this last year and was clearly trying to shoehorn kind of current events into his predictions. And then D, it is a period of growing irrationality, pessimism, superstitions, and otherworldliness. And that part is what I'm going to kind of focus on today. All these phenomena appear in the core area of a civilization before they appear in the more peripheral portions of the society. And that part is very interesting, I think, too, because essentially what he's talking about is decline and fall of empires and dark ages. And he says in that last sentence that the darkness, so to speak, appears first in the core of a civilization, not in the peripheral areas. So in other words, the metropolis of the empire is actually where the Dark Age starts. And it's out in the peripheral areas on the fringe where it actually gets to last, if it gets there at all. And so people on the fringe are more likely to actually preserve more of what was good about that civilization, which is also a very interesting thing to think about. When you think about, for example, what are things like in the DC to New York metropolis today, you can make a very strong case they're in more of a dark age than, say, out in, I don't know, the Dakotas or something. All right. So I've talked a lot on my podcast, especially in recent years, about imperial decline and collapse. Today I'm talking about dark ages. These two things I think are not the same, but they're clearly interrelated to each other, and they have a tendency to turn into a self-reinforcing negative feedback spiral, where you got a dark age going on, you got imperial decline and collapse going on, and each one causes the other one to get worse. And it just keeps on a downward spiral that eventually ends in not a very happy place. So the way I think about it is an imperial decline and collapse, you're really talking more than anything else about the political and economic system of a society. Whereas when you're talking about a dark age, you're talking about something that is much more cultural and intellectual. Again, the two are related, the two feed each other, but they're not exactly the same thing. Maybe two sides of the same coin or something like that. Now, rhetorical question, at least for now. Are we in a dark age currently?
Rhetorical.
Rhetorical questions, I guess, give rhetorical answers. Some people might say, of course we're not. Just look at technology. Every year, computers get cheaper and have more, data storage capability. Every year, my internet seems to get faster. Every year, my smartphone gets cheaper but has more stuff that it can do. How could we possibly be in a dark age? But what if dark ages start before they're obvious to the vast majority of people? What if a dark age is kind of like anything that gets bad slowly, incrementally, insidiously, and by the time it becomes blatantly obvious to just about everybody, it's already been going on for a long time? What if it's, say, something like cancer, where when it starts, you may not even know it. Your doctor may not even know it unless he just happens to do the right test at the right time. And by the time it becomes blatantly obvious and you really have symptoms like, oh, that's actually been there a long time and it's been growing. What if dark ages are the same thing? What if the dark age, say, of the Roman Empire, what if the dark age actually started long before the empire was collapsing? Okay, very often it's described in terms of you have the empire decline and collapse, and then the dark age starts. But what if the dark age actually started a long time ago and was driving the imperial collapse? And what if, at least for a while, technology is able to continue to advance, even though the dark age is also spreading and growing worse? And technology is able to keep advancing for a while, sort of like out of momentum, sort of like out of inertia. But eventually, the dark age eats away at the basis of the technological innovation of that society, the root of it. Like, for example, turning science into something that is not really science anymore. It might take a while for that to totally put a halt to technological innovation. It takes time to work its way through the institutions and cause the innovation to cease and maybe even go backwards. So what would we think about if we're talking about a dark age? There's a lot of things we could point to as far as like symptom-specific things that indicate that a dark age may be happening in a society. Just to kind of pick some to mention, and I'm going to try to not spend too much time talking about the symptoms, because I do want to try and have redemption in the third act and not just say, everything's going to shit. Good night, everybody. Even though on my bad days, that is kind of how I feel, and probably a lot of you do as well. But just to, in no particular order, some of the things that we might think about, dogmatism and arguments from force and authority become dominant. And things like curiosity, empiricism, reason, evidence, critical thinking, etc., become less and less common and become actively attacked and suppressed by dogmatism and arguments from authority. How about magical thinking? Magical thinking, I would argue, tends to get more and more predominant in a society that's going into a dark age. Magical thinking is a very interesting one. Earlier, when you were mentioning that utility companies basically are engaging in magical thinking, right? All the green revolution stuff has always struck me as essentially magical thinking. It's basically, we've got technology right now that works, but for ideological reasons, we've decided that it is bad. And so don't worry, though, because if we just ban the technology we have now, magically new technology will take its place, right? If we just ban coal power plants, suddenly solar is going to get way better, right? This is magical thinking. This is magical thinking. As a recovering addict, I can tell you, I'm very familiar with magical thinking, and I can spot it from a mile away in a snowstorm with a blindfold on. So, and you hear versions of it from both the left and the right. From the left, there's a lot of versions of it you could point to, including all the green energy nonsense. With the right, and I'm not talking about like the non-mainstream right or whatever. I'm talking about just kind of like the standard mainstream right in this country. The people that are like, oh yeah, if we just cut spending by 1% or whatever, don't worry, we'll balance the budget in no time, or that sort of thing, right? If we just drop bombs on a couple more Middle Eastern countries, the Middle East is going to be all squared away and everything will be fine. This is all magical thinking. And I would argue that both the left and the right in this country are increasingly engaging in things like magical thinking in different ways. And you could see it, for example, in the hardcore Trump MAGA people, the people that actually believe, first off, they believe if we just get him in the first time, he's actually going to make America great again and like fix every problem. And now, even after he was in there for 4 years, there's still people who are still clinging to that. If we just bring him back, he'll fix everything. It's like, well, he obviously didn't really have a strategy or an understanding of what he was up against the first time. And there's no evidence that I've seen that he's learned anything from his first, go at it, right? It's like he's going to do the same thing again and expect different results. Well, what is that? Definition of insanity? It's magical thinking. Magical thinking. Then, of course, on the left, you got, their environmental stuff, but you also have, wokeism, which is, essentially a cult. And you also have, in just the last few years, COVIDianism, where the people who, paint themselves with the label of science are increasingly the least actually scientific thinking people there are. They're the people who just want to tell you that somebody in authority said something, therefore it is true. And if you have any questions about it, if you're looking at evidence that seems to point somewhere else than what they're saying, you're a bad person and you're rejecting science. And it really started to make me think that maybe we're further along the path of a dark age than I even realized when I saw in particular the COVIDian regime. When I saw, Fauci essentially acting as like the grand inquisitor of institutional science, saying, I am Dr. Science. Science, in the true sense of the word, is not an institution of authority that tells everybody what to think and enforces that. Science, in the true sense of the word, is a method of trying to gradually, incrementally get closer to the truth by doing things like controlled experiments, testing hypotheses, looking at evidence, etc. And if you're truly in a scientific mindset, you're supposed to be always in a mindset of doubt and skepticism, even about the stuff that you believe you've discovered. You're supposed to always be trying to disprove yourself. And other scientists are supposed to be trying to constantly disprove you. But we've strayed very far from, what science is supposed to be. Another thing that you see going on that I think is leading us into a dark age in many ways is credentialism over true merit. So where somebody gets formal credentials in something and they're now considered an expert who you're supposed to trust, unless, of course, they express an opinion that's outside the dominant opinions of their field, in which case they're suddenly heretics. Versus looking at who actually knows what the hell they're talking about, who actually has a track record of having been proved right about things, that they've predicted or whatever in the past. And you see this all over the place. And it started ultimately in academia over a century ago, but it is permeated out into lots of other institutions and, fields of endeavor and whatever, where it's all about formal credentials, where you can't have, I don't care if you can prove that you can do this job and do it really well. I don't care. Do you have the formal credential? I ran into this myself multiple times during the 16 years that I was working in academia as a college history professor, where, I wanted to teach a particular class and clearly I could do it. In some cases, I had already done it, but then somebody happened to go back and look through my transcripts and go, wait a minute, that class you've been teaching successfully for like a year that like dozens of students have taken and loved? You can't do it anymore because we just suddenly realized you actually are missing like 3 credits that you need in your transcripts to be qualified to teach this class. So there's all the little things we can think of, right? Symptoms we could point to, many of which have been aggravated in recent years. Rising crime, rising addiction, rising suicide rates, etc., among many parts of the population. That's another symptom of a dark age. It's not the cause of a dark age, it's a symptom. But, other things you can think about would be being more concerned with legalism than with true justice and morality, where what really matters is not, are you actually trying to do the right thing, or at least the best thing you can, regarding a particular situation that has to do with rules or laws, but instead, here are the rigid, bureaucratically defined rules. Did you fulfill those rules? Did you do what it says in the manual? I don't care if it didn't work. I don't care if what's in the manual obviously didn't make sense in the situation you were in. What I care about is, did you do what the manual says you're supposed to do? I think that's another thing that causes a dark age to happen, or at least another symptom of a dark age. It's tricky when you start talking about these sorts of things, because you always run the risk of sounding like the proverbial get off my lawn, it was better in my day old man. See, the thing is, sometimes that old man is right, though. That's the tricky part. It's the same thing as when people dismiss all quote unquote conspiracy theories. It's like, well, yeah, a lot of them are, crazy nonsense, but sometimes people that are labeled as conspiracy theorists actually are right about something. And so you have to be careful. But in general, I try my best. I'm now over 40. I have 2 kids who are teenagers, one of whom is now in college, despite my best efforts. So I feel like I have the right not only to tell all the worst dad jokes that exist with zero shame, but I also now have the right to kind of be the grumpy old man saying, get off my lawn. It was better in my day. Kids these days, they don't know what the hell to do, But personally, I can just say that in 16 years of teaching college history, I think that's enough time to have sort of a sample size, to watch students come through my classes for 16 years and watch, like, over time, what were the trends. And I can tell you for sure that the average intellectual level, for lack of a better term, of students coming through my classes declined noticeably and measurably over those 16 years. Now, individual exceptions, right up to the very last year I was teaching, I still had individual students who were wonderful. So if any of them, ever listen to this, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the average and the majority. So clearly something is going on. And once you start to get into a dark age, a mindset starts to take hold among more and more people, which is, even if they're aware of their ignorance, they're okay with it. And in some cases, they're even like proud of it. And you can see this on display again. It's not the exclusive preserve of either the left or right in this country. If you think it is, you're wrong. Now, at certain moments in time, some of them may be worse than others, temporarily. I would argue that during the George W. Bush era, the right was actually more in a dark age mentality in a lot of ways. More recently, I think the left is more in a dark age mentality than the right. But I don't think anybody has a monopoly on dark age thinking and dark age trends. And I found this when I was reading a few different books about dark ages, including some books about, is the U.S. in a dark age or whatever? Or are we on the cusp of falling into one? I ran into this a few times. One of the authors that I read a bit of in thinking about what I was going to say for today is a guy named Morris Berman, who is some kind of academic. I don't know if he's still alive or not. If he is, he's quite old. And I think he was a sociologist by formal degrees or whatever. But he kind of, dabbles in history and cultural criticism and things like this. And he's written a series of interesting books kind of around the question of is, current day America in a dark age? And what I ran into with him is that he sees almost all of it. And he was writing these books, by the way, during the George W. Bush years. And he sees the dark age as being primarily like a right-wing / Republican thing. Now, most of his criticisms of the George W. Bush administration and the majority of rank and file Republicans during that time period, I agree with. I think he's right in a lot of what he points out as, bad things about those people during that time period. But the problem is he then has a blind eye towards the other side and their own tendencies towards irrationality, dogmatism, arguments from authority, etc. I tried to look it up in preparation for this, but I couldn't find it. But somewhere 15, 20 years ago, I remember coming across a study that was done. And the study showed, and I remember when I read this, I was like, oh yeah, we're in trouble. The study showed, happens a lot. The study showed that a higher percentage of the American people believed in the literal existence of magic than could accurately locate Japan on a map. Think about that. And think about all the other crazy stuff that people believe in. And how many of them couldn't find Japan on a map, or couldn't find Iraq on a map, or couldn't find whatever. So, another thing that you see in Dark Age civilizations is that identity becomes more important than things like logical discourse, reason and evidence, the scientific method, trying to engage somebody who thinks differently than you to try and understand what they believe and decide what you think of that. That instead, it essentially, society starts to devolve into prison gangs. In prison gangs, if you don't know, it's all based on race, identity, not even anything you chose, just an accident of who you happen to be born to. Nobody goes in and into prison and is like, all right, I'm going to shop around to the different gangs, and I'm going to decide which ones are in most alignment with my values, and then I'm going to join that one, and that's what I'm going to do. No, it's just, oh, you happen to be this identity, boom, you're in with these people. And if you look around at current day America, isn't that in a way what's going on? And it's an interesting thing to think about. How come in prisons, prison guards not only tolerate ethnic gangs and things like that, they actually kind of encourage it very often. Why? Yeah, it's a method of control. It's, number one, it's divide and conquer, right? Because all the different gangs are not teaming up against, when that happens, it's called a prison riot, right? And people tend to get killed and it's bad. But it's a way to keep them divided into separate groups against each other. And it's also a way to just keep order, right? It's just a way to impose structure on these, very unruly people. Well, is that just going on a larger scale, right? Is the whole place, in a sense, getting turned into an open air prison And the prison guards that run it are deciding, you know what? It'd be better off if we just had people into these simplified groups where who they associate with, who they work with, even what they believe is determined not based on them doing thinking, doing research, having discussions, figuring it out for themselves as, independent individuals, but let's just encourage everybody to just identify with whatever identity group you happen to have been dropped into by luck, and that's that. And that's a society. Obviously, you can never have anything remotely resembling a functioning democratic republic in that situation. Essentially, what you have is a prison. Another thing I couldn't help but thinking about, and if you've listened to my podcast, I'm always interested in this stuff, is, and again, you could say I sound like an old man yelling at a cloud, but I think it's true. Just think about how so many of our films and things for quite a while now are not new. They're just reboots, remakes, sequels, prequels of stuff, very often stuff that was actually created 40 plus years ago. That is a culture that is in stagnation or even decay. It's no longer capable of coming up with, a whole new thing in terms of like a fictional universe, franchise, whatever. Instead, all it can do is take stuff that better people created decades ago and just rehash it. And have you noticed that the reboots, prequels, sequels, etc., are always vastly inferior to the originals in just about every way, right? I mean, has anybody seen like the 5th Predator movie? I sure hope not. I sure hope that the people who would attend this thing would have more sense than to do something that masochistic to themselves. But, you watch and you might say, well, Predator is just, just throwaway action movie. It's like, well, it's part of our culture though. Like pop culture is a big part of our culture. And so if you go watch the original Predator movie or the original Terminator movie, and then go watch whatever's the latest, part 7 or whatever, there's a huge difference. And I don't think it's just me as an old man wanting to cling to the way things were when I was young. And my evidence for that is this. My kids, who are Gen Z teenagers, they like the old stuff better when they're exposed to it. They like the original Star Wars movies better than whatever Disney has shat out recently. And I don't force them to like it better. I let them watch it and they're like, wow, that was better. Or I put on the original Indiana Jones movies. My kids are like, oh, this is great. This is way better than any recent stuff I've seen. They even like when my kids were littler, they even like the older cartoons better. Think about that. Cartoons were better. Cartoons were more intelligently written a few decades ago than they are now. So, also, by the way, if you look closely at a lot of the recent reboots, prequels, sequels, etc., watch closely, even setting aside all the wokeism and all the stuff that the recent South Park special made fun of very, very well. Look closely, even set aside all the identity politics, wokeism critiques. Look closely at the people they're now giving you as heroes in those things. How often they actually don't behave like heroes. So it's not just that there's an intellectual decline, there is like a moral or ethical decline, where what we used to think of as what a hero would do, how a hero would behave, why the good guys are the good guys, why the bad guys are the bad guys in a fictional story, very often now you'll find the supposed hero behaving in ways that in previous eras would have been, that's the villain. And you can see that a lot if you have the misfortune to watch any of the recent Disney Marvel or Disney Star Wars junk. Right? Just think about like if you had the bad luck to watch the Scarlet Witch show. I'm pretty sure she was a villain if you were looking at it fairly. But they're presenting her as, oh yeah, she's a great hero. So what's going on? Well, I think in a way is that there's no longer a kind of common baseline of morality and reality, that it's being lost. And not only is it being lost, it's being lost, and most people don't even realize it's being lost. Hence the Lord of the Rings quote. It's like this meta loss. It's like not only are you losing something, most people don't even realize that they're losing it. So, and I'll come back to that idea more in a moment. But I could go on and on and on, and I won't bore you with statistics and whatever, but there's just lots of indicators, lots of what we would think of as negative social indicators in the statistics that have been going up. Some of them have been going up for quite a while, right? Again, whether it's addiction, overdoses, divorce rates, illegitimacy rates, crime rates of all sorts, all these sorts of things, right? Lots of evidence that something is going on. And I was actually talking to somebody earlier about this very idea, but let me share with you a quote from somebody who I'm gonna talk just a little bit more about her take on this. Have any of you heard of Jane Jacobs? The name ring a bell? Have any of you read the book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities? Have any of you heard of it? Yeah. She's the author of that. It's a very interesting book. But another book she wrote quite a bit later that's also interesting is called Dark Age Ahead. And she wrote this back in 2004, just a few years before she died. And in Dark Age Ahead, she talks about civilizations that go through a dark age. They experience a form of amnesia. It's not just that their culture and its virtues are lost and forgotten. It's that people don't even know it was there to begin with. It's like meta lost. And in kind of giving an example of this, she says, in North America, a couple of decades ago, it was common to hear residents remark as they locked up for a short departure from home that they never used to need to lock their doors. Nowadays, the remark is seldom heard. People who once didn't need to lock their doors have gradually died off. And so even the memory of what has been lost is now lost. So it's not even that there's the crotchety old people going around, in my day, we never had to lock our doors, and now you got to, and isn't that a sign of how far things have declined? It's like now there's not even those people around to say that, because nobody can even remember that existed. So in Dark Age Ahead, again, she talks about this idea that cultures that go through a dark age suffer from amnesia eventually. And, when we hear Dark Age, we most commonly think of the medieval Europe Dark Age, right? The first few centuries after the collapse of Rome. That's like the most famous Dark Age. That's like the original in terms of things being labeled Dark Ages. But in fact, there have been lots of Dark Ages in many different times and places throughout history. In some ways, one of the most overwhelmingly total ones that ever happened was the Greek Dark Age, when the original Mycenaean Greek civilization collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age. And Greece actually, for several centuries, went way backward in terms of almost anything you could think of. Literacy, culture, arts, technology, population declined dramatically. Cities became almost empty in many areas, all these sorts of things. Now, eventually there was a rebirth, and eventually you got an even, quote unquote, greater Greek civilization, like the classical civilization of, Golden Age Athens and all that stuff. But that didn't happen until the previous Greek civilization had essentially disintegrated into nothing, collapsed into a complete dark age for centuries in which there was almost no writing. And then eventually a new culture kind of emerged from the ashes. So Jane Jacobs says, during a dark age, the mass amnesia of survivors becomes permanent and profound. The previous way of life slides into an abyss of forgetfulness, almost as decisively as if it had not existed. Are we getting pessimistic enough? I figure at an event like this, I'm probably very guilty of preaching to the choir. I'm probably very guilty of engaging in confirming your biases. But in my defense, I'll say two things. Number one, the choir still needs to be preached to. And number two, for the preacher to be doing a good job, even to the choir, hopefully he's kind of putting things together in a new way so that you'll see things differently from a different perspective, maybe see some connections and things you haven't seen before. And so that's what I'm trying to do here. But, another thing I almost forgot, very important. Another way to think about it, aside from amnesia, is that a culture in a dark age essentially gets senile. And eventually, this senility gets so bad that you end up in that complete dark age where you've forgotten your own writing system. You don't even know that there used to be a much more advanced culture and civilization that lived where you lived, that your ancestors were part of, right? And that's all gone. And isn't it interesting, maybe not a coincidence, that as our culture is going senile, so are the leaders of almost all of our institutions, and not just the political leaders, but obviously them too. But look around at, how many heads of giant corporations are, 70, 80 years old. Look around at how many college and university presidents currently are, 70, 80-year-old boomers, right? In the 90s, the average age of a college president, I think, was around 50 years old. They were boomers. Now, the average age of a college president is something like 75 years old. Guess what? They're the same people. They never left, right? And it does seem, maybe it's not universal, but it does seem like a common thing that when a society is going through, degrading into a dark age and maybe also going through an imperial decline and collapse, there is an increasing tendency of the leaders to be more and more gerontocracy, a bunch of corrupt, very elderly people who are not even all there. And you could not only, see that in our current system. Look back to the latter days of the Soviet Union, and you'll see the exact same thing. Increasingly, the leaders are a whole bunch of old people. So people might say that in our time, a dark age is impossible. Yeah, sure, there used to be dark ages in medieval Europe or ancient Greece or any of these other places. But in our day, you can't have a dark age because technology, globalization, the internet, printed materials, writing, etc. And I would say that's not necessarily true. Aside from the fact that a giant disaster could, do something like take out the internet or something like that, even if nothing that big and dramatic happens, nonetheless, you can still lose the essentials of what made a civilization work and what made it viable, what made it innovative, what made it produce human flourishing, innovation, progress, wealth, prosperity, all those things. And here's why. And I was kind of struggling with, because I kind of had a sense of this, I was struggling with how to put it together and think about it. And then I came across it in that Jane Jacobs book that I've mentioned. She points out that true cultures, in the deep sense of the word, are transmitted primarily two ways. And it's not through communication technology, it's not through the internet, it's not even through the printed word, because those things can be lost and destroyed. And also people can just lose the ability to even understand a particular writing system. The two ways that cultures are transmitted in a viable culture. Number one, by word of mouth. Particularly, most importantly through parents and grandparents, etc., teaching their children, right? But also by example. That's the other one. And so if increasingly it's hard to find anybody who is willing and able to transmit the culture by word of mouth, directly one-on-one with, the rising next generation, and if increasingly it's difficult to find people who actually live the example of the best ideals of that culture, then it doesn't matter if there's a bunch of books sitting in a library somewhere, rotting away and getting eaten by silverfish, in a library that no one goes to except for homeless people who want to use it to look at internet porn. It doesn't matter. The culture's lost. So, are we doomed? Is there nothing we can do? Are the barbarians not invading? Instead, are the formerly civilized people gradually degenerating into barbarians? What if that's what actually happens? More so than the barbarians coming from outside. Are we doomed? Well, to be honest with you, I think if you're talking about just the short to medium term mainstream society of this country, and related cultures like Canadian or whatever, I think probably, yeah, it's not going to be turned around anytime in the short to medium term. We're probably too far gone down the path of falling into a dark age for that to happen. But we could still have redemption in the third act. Still means that we can do things. We can't change the macro, like entire civilization, but we can still do things to try and not participate in the civilizational collapse that's going on around us. We just choose to not participate in it as much as we can. Cultural renaissances are possible, at least on a small scale, even if a larger civilization is going through a collapse into a dark age. So, what can we do? Number one, do not look to top-down solutions to come from the state or any other big institutions. You're wasting your time, I think, if you think if we just elect President so-and-so, our civilization is going to be healthy and all those things are going to be reversed. Not going to happen. I would also say do not look to any ideology that is based on like a genuine reactionary, let's go turn the clock back literally to an earlier time. Again, that's magical thinking. It's just not going to happen. Not going to happen. And it probably won't really solve the problem, because then all you're going to do is just end up in that dogmatic way of thinking, that, superstitious, non-rational, non-scientific way of thinking. And cultures and civilizations that try and freeze themselves, frozen in time, tend not to be very viable. Either they collapse entirely or they become so stagnant that you're essentially living in a dark age. Healthy, vibrant cultures are open to the outside, not in a way of like, inferiority complex of like, oh yeah, my culture is inferior, every other culture is better, but in the way of, say, like the Romans, when they were still doing pretty well as a civilization, they would adopt things from other cultures when they encountered them. If another culture that they interacted with did something better, they would learn from it. The famous Roman sword, the gladius, the full name of it is the gladius hispaniensis. What does that mean? Well, the Romans didn't invent it. They stole it from the Spanish, from the Celtic Spanish that they conquered early on in their empire. They conquered these Spaniards, made them part of their empire, and then like, that sword those guys use, that's a really good sword. Let's figure out how they make that. Let's start issuing it to our troops. So that's just one example, but you can see it in music, literature, all these things. Healthy cultures are open to outside influences. They're not, so open that they abandon their own culture and just adopt everything else and assume everything else is superior. But, open-minded in a reasonable sense of, I'm willing to learn from other cultures if they're better at something than mine is, if they've got something I can learn from them. So one of the places where I've been doing more of my reading lately is in the dissidents of the late Cold War Czechoslovakia, right? Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, part of the Iron Curtain, right? Part of the Soviet Empire, one of their satellite states. And in the 70s and 80s, a movement started to rise that was resisting the Moscow-backed, Czechoslovakian communist regime. What I find so interesting about the Czech dissidents, as opposed to the dissidents in some of the other parts of the Soviet Empire, is that the Czech dissidents, at least their leadership, they were primarily artists and intellectuals. And they had like a whole thought out philosophy of what they were doing. It wasn't like, if you're familiar with, say, Solidarity in Poland, which also stood up to communism, that was different. That was more of like an organic labor movement resisting communist rule. And it was like blue collar guys starting off as just like meat and potatoes issues, like we want better conditions and better hours and whatever. And eventually it became a political movement and took down the communist regime there. And that's great and admirable, and I'm all for it, but I just find it a little bit more interesting, for lack of a better term, to look at the Czech dissidents, because there are a whole bunch of artists and intellectuals. And number one, when we think of artists and intellectuals, we don't usually think of people that accomplish stuff in the real world very much. But these guys actually did. They brought down a communist regime in Czechoslovakia. And secondly, we tend to think of, at least in our own recent history, artists and intellectuals, we tend to think of being more likely to be communist or communist sympathizing. But in the case of the Czech dissidents, they were not. They were standing up against the communist regime. So it's very interesting. Politics really is downstream from culture. The leader of the Czech dissident movement was a guy named Václav Havel. He was a playwright. He wrote plays. That's where he came from. And he eventually became the leader and eventually became the first president of a non-communist Czechoslovakia. And his movement that he was a part of actually began because the communist Czechoslovakian regime arrested a rock band. There was a rock band in, I think, like 1969, 1970 in communist Czechoslovakia called the Plastic People of the Universe or something like that. And it was like an attempt to have like an American or British like psychedelic band in, behind the Iron Curtain in communist Czechoslovakia. And the regime, persecuted them and eventually arrested them. And that arrest of a rock band, which I've never listened to their music. I've read in history books about all this, that they're not even a very good band. Like, it wasn't that their music was so great that the people were like, oh man, we have to save this band. It's like, no, they're a pretty mediocre band. But the fact that the regime thought it was so dangerous to have a rock band that wasn't just pumping out communist talking points given to them by the regime, that alone was so dangerous that they had to be silenced and arrested. And that ultimately led to the founding of a movement called Charter 77, which was a movement, trying to make Czechoslovakia a more humane and free place. And in his writings, Václav Havel talks a lot about how the way to resist both a bad regime and a kind of corrupt, degenerate society is not in the ways most people think of like, starting a political movement or starting a resistance army or whatever like that. That the real key is to live in the truth. To just refuse as much as you possibly can to participate in or to, mouth the platitudes of the corrupt regime and the corrupt society that you're a part of. And they talk a lot about building a parallel society, parallel structures, parallel institutions and organizations. And some of them talk about a second culture or a parallel polis. The idea is we're not going to go confront directly the communist regime that is ruling over us. That won't accomplish anything. They're going to win. They're going to win. They're going to round us all up, throw us all in prison, whatever. Instead, as much as we possibly can, we're just going to build our own replacement institutions while the communist regime is still there. And yeah, they're going to, crack down on us sometimes, and, there's dangers to it and whatever, but we don't care. And the movement is going to eventually spread as more and more people. It's kind of like one of those things, so many of those psychological experiments reveal, where if everybody's pretending that a lie is true, and then one weirdo is like, no, that's wrong. 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. Once that one person does it, it's more likely someone else will do it and go, yeah, that guy's right. 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. It equals 4. And then eventually, more and more people decide to stop pretending they believe things that they know not to be true. And I think that's at the root of a dark age, and how to, at least in your own little circle of influence, fight against it, is to simply refuse to be part of the decline and collapse, and to speak the truth as you understand it, and to live in the truth. So I'll wrap up with a little bit of a lengthy quote, but I think it's a good one. From Václav Havel. This is stitching together several passages from his essay, which is very interesting, very much worth reading. I highly recommend checking it out. It's called The Power of the Powerless. He describes the communist system as it existed in the 70s and 80s as post-totalitarian, meaning it's not the same Stalinist totalitarian regime we used to have. It's not that brutal. It's not that blatant. But it still is very authoritarian and still is, forcing people to live in ways that are detrimental to being happy. And he says the post-totalitarian system touches people at every step, but it does so with its ideological gloves on. That is why life in the system is so thoroughly permeated with hypocrisy and lies. Because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything. It falsifies the past, it falsifies the present, and it falsifies the future. Individuals need not believe in these mystifications. Accidentally click something. There we go. But they must behave as though they did, or they must tolerate them in silence, or get along with those who work within them. For this reason, they must live within a lie. They need not accept the lie. It is enough for them to have accepted their life within it, with it and in it. For by this very fact, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, are the system. But it is built on lies. It works only as long as people are willing to live within the lie. In the post-totalitarian system, this line runs de facto through each person. For everyone in his or her own way is both a victim and a supporter of the systems. Alienated humanity supports the system as its own involuntary master plan, as a degenerate image of its own degeneration, as a record of people's failure as individuals. Yeah. Trying to scroll down. That's all I know. Living within the lie can constitute the system only if it is universal. Everybody's got to be looking at each other going, yeah, the emperor's new clothes are awesome. That's the only way it'll work. That's why they often will try to crack down, even if like somebody with no power and very few numbers is saying, no, the emperor's naked, they can't tolerate it. Because as soon as somebody starts to speak the truth, it starts to reveal the whole thing. The principle must embrace and permeate everything. There are no terms whatsoever on which it can coexist with living within the truth, and therefore everyone who steps out of line denies it in principle and threatens it in its entirety. If the main pillar of the system is living a lie, then it is not surprising that the fundamental threat to it is living the truth. This is why it must be suppressed more severely than anything else. Living within the truth is an attempt to regain control over one's own sense of responsibility. A better system will not automatically ensure a better life. In fact, the opposite is true. Only by creating a better life will a better system be developed. So, as far as things to do, and I'll leave on this, I'll repeat what Jack has often said over the years. What you do matters, even in your own humble little sphere. What you do to not participate in the Dark Age and to try and have a little tiny renaissance in your own little circle does matter. Just like, a bunch of artists in Czechoslovakia in 1969 going, hey, it's messed up that they arrested a rock band they didn't like. That meant something. And it took a while, but eventually it brought down the regime. So build parallel institutions. Build your parallel society. Do the DIY thing. Don't expect that Disney is going to fix, our pop culture. Make your own. Build your own. Be very careful about your news and entertainment diet. I'm very prone to depression, and I've had to consciously abstain from consuming news. I don't know a whole lot about what's going on in the Israel-Palestine thing. I don't want to know. Because there's nothing I can do about it, and it's just going to make me depressed and feel powerless. One other thing I'll mention that, some of the stuff I've said, maybe a lot of you have already thought of. I know some of it is, very similar to things that Jack has been saying over the years. But one other just kind of like nuts and bolts suggestion I have, physical media is important. Get the books that you want to preserve. Get the movies you want to preserve. Physical media. Disney is already retroactively either throwing into the memory hole or modifying old movies that don't fit with the times. If you want, your favorite movies to still be available in the form they were originally in, go buy DVDs, Blu-rays, VHS if that's the only thing it's on. Okay, but these are the sorts of ways that you can be in a small scale way, like those monks during the Dark Ages in Europe who preserved a lot of the wisdom of the Romans. So, in closing, I'll just say a cultural renaissance can happen on a small, localized scale, even in the midst of a larger Dark Age that's going on. And I'm sure most or all of you are already doing this, but, just words of encouragement. Refuse to participate in the Dark Age. Refuse to participate in the Dark Age. Live in the truth the best you can, as much as you can. Create your own, works of culture that are not degenerate, and be part of a new renaissance and a new counterculture. Thank you very much for your time and your ears.
All right, we do have some time for questions. Online folks, put questions in all caps and I'll look at it. Does anybody want to walk up to that mic over there and ask a question? No? You just want to put your orange peel away? Okay, go for it.
Thanks so much, CJ. I think your conclusions were brilliant, and I
Thank you.
think that we tend to agree with everything you said. I just had a few niggling concerns or questions.
Mhm.
You mentioned age of reason. I would hesitate to put a lot of emphasis on that, realizing that the French Revolution was an age of reason, and I think we probably are not too happy with the outcome there.
Yeah, I would say that is sort of like a caricature of reason. It's essentially making a dogmatic cult out of one
Right.
particular understanding of reason.
That could never happen now.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I'm not a fan of where the French Revolution went. I am a fan of some of the places where it started.
Sure.
Before it went totally off the rails and the Reign of Terror and the Jacobins took over. But yeah.
And I think your emphasis on the idea that ideologies need to be put aside in terms of seeking truth and beauty in our own way, I think that's really important. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd agree with that.
Go ahead, Sean.
So there seems to be a lot of writing on the collapse of this thing or that thing. Have you read anything interesting that you can recommend on what happened after the collapse? Like, so the Power of the Powerless, it sounds like maybe that was about what happened after the collapse of the Soviet or during the collapse.
Mhm.
Any other recommendations along that line?
Yeah, well,
The good news,
sure. Yeah. Well, one thing that I've talked about when I've covered the decline and fall of empires in various ways in recent years is that, one of the things that defines an empire is size, right? It's large in geography and population. It's usually diverse as well in geography and population. And so when an empire collapses, different parts of it will fare differently. And some of them might actually be better off pretty quickly. Others might go into an extended, period of regression, dark age, hard times, whatever. And a lot of it depends on just sort of the circumstance of that particular like former province or area or whatever of the empire, where if it's a place that still has a pretty intact, viable culture, and if it's a place that, whether officially or unofficially, had some degree of like local self-government within the imperial system they used to be a part of, that place is more likely to do better than a place that doesn't have those things. And as the Carol Quigley quote that I shared towards the beginning indicates, very often the place that was like the center, the metropolis of the empire, does the worst when it collapses. And it's some, usually not all, but some of the more peripheral areas that do relatively better. And so an interesting thing about the collapse of the Soviet Union is that the places that tended to do better in the aftermath, and sometimes it took a while to transition to the new thing, and sometimes it was pretty quick, but the places that tended to do better when the Soviet Empire collapsed were the more peripheral satellite states. So like Czechoslovakia did pretty well, a lot of other places like Poland, did relatively well. Russia itself actually was one of the hardest hit places where things got the worst in almost every way you could measure. Oh shoot, as far as good books to recommend, oh man, after the day I had yesterday, I'm in a bit of brain fog, to be honest with you today, but there's a very interesting book. I don't agree with everything he's got to say. He's got certain biases, but it's very interesting. It's called Reinventing Collapse. And it's by a guy who I think was originally from Russia, then immigrated as a young man to the US, named Dmitry Orlov. And it's a very interesting book where he talks about kind of what the former Soviet world went through in the aftermath, as far as how things collapsed and degenerated and how corrupt things got, and how it got to a point where, if you wanted to get a train ticket to go from Moscow to St. Petersburg, you'd be better off if you had a bottle of liquor to barter with the guy at the train station than if you had, a sack full of rubles that were worth nothing, right? And that's an interesting book. there's a few others. I just can't think of the titles right now, unfortunately. Yeah.
So around the campfire tonight, when they come to you, you can tell Sean the other books.
I'll try to remember.
Thank you, CJ. I appreciate and agree with all you say.
Oh, good. Then we're done here.
Yep. As a slight encouragement, maybe. Not only do I remember a time when the front door wasn't locked, so will my son. And he is currently practicing for a play called The Emperor's New Clothes.
Nice.
So it is happening in places.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Next question. This is the last. You get the last question.
Man, totally appreciate you coming out and respect your research, but part of discourse is disagreement.
Okay.
And it's real easy to get trapped in the negative. And somebody that's fought depression off and on most of my life would like to point out we've got so many positives. Like, I refuse to admit that we're entering a dark age. We have so many great, fantastic things going on. You know, we've got politics coming up, and everybody's like, man, these jackasses hate each other. But it's no different than when Jefferson and Adams were buying newspapers back in the day and being horrible to each other. You know, you see on the news, we're like, man, these kids are having to do school shooter drills. We never did that. It's true. But, you know, my kids never had to hide under his desk because we were practicing for nuclear bombs coming. Yeah.
They might have to again soon, considering how things are going.
You know, it's possible, and I might walk out the gate and get hit by a car. But
I hope we still have some of those magical Cold War desks, because those things are a desk that if you just get under it in the fetal position, you're safe from an H-bomb going off. That is a hell of a desk. I hope those are still in a warehouse somewhere that they can pull them out for World War III.
Yeah, so I just wanted to be a little bit of respectful dissent that I don't think we're in a dark age. I mean, things aren't great, but when one of the greatest issues with our country is obesity, let's think about that. One of the biggest problems we face as a country, if we have excessive amounts of food, maybe not great.
To take the other side, though,
of it.
you could also argue that the rise in obesity, among other things, reveals a decline in.
We can. Again, it's not a debate on if things are going to go to hell or not, but I just wanted to throw out that we don't all have to be lost. Things aren't at an all-time low in history, that there's always lows and they're followed by highs. And, you know, I appreciate coming here every year because it picks me up, because I'm surrounded by a bunch of like-minded people which are looking for the good. Whereas we might be getting ready for, if it's not, that's not the focus. So again, I appreciate your podcast. I enjoy listening to it, but life isn't always gloomy, and we can always find some snarkiness and some fun and some happiness in it. So, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. And I, just as an individual, like I mentioned, one of the things that I try to do and that I suggest to other people, because, I'm trying to be realistic about where things actually are in terms of imperial decline and collapse, and in terms of dark ages. I'm trying to be realistic, so not to blind myself in an optimistic way, but yet simultaneously trying to not get bogged down myself into, nothing but pessimism and depression. So
There's a better way to do things.
No.
Oh.
Dark age or not dark age. Before he lost his mind and changed his name, Zen Armani called it dim age.
Yeah.
You're both right.
and didn't he kind of like I don't
Totally fucking nuts.
I haven't really followed him in a long time, but yeah, didn't he basically like go into his own dark age where he kind of like turned to magic or something like that, or am I wrong?
He went full Eastern Orthodox religion. He lives on Saipan.
Yeah. So
All right. Let's be back here in about 15 minutes for the panel discussion. Thank you, CJ. CJ will be around for you to talk to.